Have you ever been in an easy class that you're doing well in and didn't think you needed to study for finals? But when your final test grade came back, you failed? Us too. This is an example of overconfidence bias. Overconfidence bias is when people are too confident about their abilities, causing them to take greater risks. The consequences of overconfidence can be seen numerous times in US history, especially in relation to security issues.
One example of this is Pearl Harbor. In 1941, the Japanese Navy launched an attack on the U.S. military base in Pearl Harbor, prompting the U.S. to declare war on Japan and join the Allied forces in World War II. In this case study, an example of overconfidence bias is the United States' overconfidence in its own military and the underestimation of Japan's. The Japanese military were winning against the land invasion of the weaker China, and Japan's naval capacities had not been significantly tested. The United States also believed that its own vessels and militia were so much more advanced than Japan's that the chance of an attack was slim to none. It would not dare take on the might of the United States military. Stereotyping was also a factor when evaluating Japan's military capabilities. There was a widely held stereotype that Japanese goods were of an inferior quality, and this carried over to their military. Stereotyping also played a role in this scenario, as the believed physical stereotypes of the Japanese people further added to the United States' overconfidence that Japan would not attack. The second factor that demonstrates overconfidence bias in the case of Pearl Harbor was the ignoring of military and intelligence evidence that pointed towards an imminent attack on the United States by Japan. In 1940 and 41, reports were given to the U.S. military and government officials that highlighted the threat of Japan to the United States and the possibility of war across the Pacific. The U.S. naval intelligence had intercepted Japanese phone transmissions indicating such an attack. However, the U.S. was overconfident and assumed the Japanese would take a defensive stance and wait for the U.S. to attack. This is in conjunction with the ostrich effect, as they ignored important information.
Think Pearl Harbor was the only time overconfidence bias played a part in intelligence failures? Think again. The United States failure at the Bay of Pigs was also partially due to an overconfidence bias. In 1959, Fidel Castro took over Cuba and established a communist government, which the U.S. saw as a direct threat. The U.S. attempted to orchestrate a coup using Cuban exiles to overthrow Castro. Having recently successfully orchestrated a coup in Iran in 1953, the CIA was confident they would succeed in Cuba. This is an example of overconfidence bias, as they believed they could repeat their success even with huge tactical errors. The last-minute change in location from Trinidad to the Bay of Pigs was a huge mistake, and one that the U.S. pushed aside to continue the attack anyway. The Bay of Pigs was Castro's favorite fishing spot and surrounded by mountains and the largest swamp in Cuba, meaning that the invaders were at a disadvantage. It was also 50 miles from the nearest village, prohibiting any sympathetic civilians from joining the fight. The Bay of Pigs was one of the worst possible locations that the CIA could have chosen, and yet the U.S. attacked anyway, leading to one of the largest intelligence failures in U.S. history. Despite the change of landing location and the obvious disadvantages it contained, the CIA continued the next day with the attack. By continuing the attack, the CIA not only suffered from overconfidence bias, but also choice supportive bias. Choice supportive bias is when people feel positive about a previous choice even when it has flaws. The CIA displayed choice supportive bias when they continued with the operation, despite President Kennedy's apprehensions and the debilitating change of location.
As you can see, the intelligence community and the policy officials allowed their overconfidence to influence how they perceived Japan and Cuba. This ultimately resulted in the failure to stop the proposed invasion of Cuba and prevent the attack on Pearl Harbor.
Created using Powtoon.